Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm Stephanie Wiles, and I'm the Henry Heinz II Director of the Art Gallery. And it's a great pleasure to have my colleague Dave Skelly, the director of the Peabody, here to co-host a conversation on the exhibition Crafting Worldviews, Art and Science in Europe, 1500 to 1800. This exhibition continues a series of partnerships between the gallery and the Peabody. We've been sharing collections and mining our holdings together for a number of years now. What's different about what you'll see today, what you'll hear, and what you'll see in the exhibition are the objects. These range from pocket-sized microscopes and telescopes to anatomical mannequins and ivory. Jessie and Paola, who you'll meet in a few minutes, have brought together these amazing objects from the History of Science and Technology division at the Peabody. With these and many other works from the gallery, from the Yale Center for British Art, from the Beinecke, and even the Walpole, they've mined all of the collections on campus, Jessie and Paola created conversations around science and art. Their themes touch on trade and exploration, European colonialism and territorial dominance on a global scale, and the ideas and the works they selected are just amazing. I'm thrilled to celebrate their research here today, and Dave will introduce Jessie and Paola.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. And this day, I will say, has been a long time coming. When I started as director at the Peabody, there was a conversation ongoing, this was in 2014, already ongoing about a joint exhibition around scientific instruments with Paola Bertucci as one of the curators. And for a whole lot of reasons, things ebbed and flowed over time. What has happened in between all of that is that when I started as director, the idea of a joint exhibition between the Art Gallery and the Peabody wasn't necessarily unprecedented or anything, but it wasn't just part of the regular diet of what we were doing. And sitting here today, that has absolutely changed. Our two institutions work together just hand in glove on all kinds of fronts, and this exhibition is part of a pattern that has emerged. I had an opportunity to spend some time before this event going through the exhibition, and it's tremendous. You're really going to enjoy it if you haven't seen it yet. And Friday is my lab day. So I came from my lab where modern analogs of some of the instruments that are on display up there were being used by my students. I was sitting with them and working with them and thinking about them in a way that made me entirely unprepared for what I was reading as I came into the exhibit. And I say that in a very good way, that all kinds of people need to come to this exhibition, and they will come into it with their preconceptions, how they kind of load into their minds what they're doing, and walk out of the exhibition thinking about it very differently. So I can declare success for me as a viewer of the exhibition. And now I want to just spend a minute introducing each of our curators for this exhibition, and then I'm going to get out of the way. So first I want to introduce Jessie Park. Jessie is the Nina and Lee Griggs Assistant Curator of European Art at UAG. She specializes in 16th and 17th century Dutch and Flemish art with a secondary area of expertise in the visual culture of global exchange from the late 16th to the early 19th century. Before she came to Yale in April of 2020, what a heck of a time to join any institution, she served as the Rousseau Curatorial Fellow in European Art at the Harvard Art Museums from 2016 to 2019. She also held previous curatorial roles at the Getty in LA and the Huntington in San Marino, California, where she contributed to and curated exhibitions, among other projects. Paola Bertucci is an associate professor in the history department at Yale University. Her research focuses on science, technology, and medicine in the 17th and 18th century in Europe. She is the author of the prize-winning Artisanal Enlightenment, Science, and the Mechanical Arts in Old Regime France, published by Yale Press in 2017. And she's the author of In the Land of Marvels, Science, Fabricated Realities, and Industrial Espionage in the Age of the Grand Tour, which will be published this fall by Johns Hopkins University Press. Paola is the curator of the History of Science and Technology Division of the Peabody Museum, and I very much encourage you, of course, to enjoy the current temporary exhibition here and view that as one in a set of opportunities to see scientific instruments in a museum setting. We're going to be opening in January of '24 the first permanent exhibition ever at Yale in the history of science and technology. And with that, I'll invite Jessie to come up.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Before Paola and I speak, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Neontic, and Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. And Paola will come up to stage and join me. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And we're really grateful that you were able to come spend time with us on a Friday afternoon, and also for your great interest in our newly opened exhibition entitled Crafting Worldviews, Art and Science in Europe, 1500 to 1800. So I'll turn it quickly over to Paola if she wants to say a few words to our audience before we begin our conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. That's enough for now.
Okay. So since the show just opened, many of our audience members may not be aware of what the exhibition is about. Stephanie gave us a very nice overview of the exhibition, but I think it might be worth kind of repeating a little bit of that content further by myself and Paola. So this show addresses the inseparable relationship between art, science, and European colonialism during the early modern period. And we have about nearly 100 objects showcased in this exhibition, and they really range across media, from really globes to maps, to botanical natural history books, to like what Stephanie mentioned, anatomical mannequins. There are really a whole wide range of objects that really make us really think about this period that really influences and shapes the ways in which we think about the world today.
Yes, and I'll just add that it is entirely based on Yale collections, as you heard from Stephanie already, and that our aim is to foreground materials that scientific instruments and works of art have in common, to emphasize histories of extraction, collaboration, and to foreground also the role of indigenous communities and individuals, as well as enslaved Africans who contributed, as we will discuss later today, to the making of scientific knowledge in Europe.
Yeah, so Paola and I will sort of talk about our intellectual approach to this exhibition. So Paola, for you, what was your intellectual approach to this project, and what was it like to work with somebody outside your discipline?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is to thank UAG for offering me the opportunity to work with Jessie on this exhibition. As a scholar, as an historian of science, medicine, and technology in early modern Europe, I'm mostly interested in artisanal practices rather than in the big heroes of science. I've always looked for the marginalized in historical sources, really being skeptical of mainstream narratives that emphasize a set group of well-known people that usually tend to be men. And so I was looking for opportunities to share with broader audiences this approach to my historical sources. I also have a strong interest in material culture and in scientific practice, experimental practice. And my first area of expertise when I was a PhD student was the history of 18th century electricity. Now, during this collaboration with Jessie and other art historians on campus, I learned to think of these objects not only as scientific objects, but also as artifacts. And so really pay attention to the materials they're made of. And so you see in this case from our exhibition a couple of toys. These are scientific instruments that were used for entertainment in 18th century Europe and in the American colonies, playing with electricity. And we can spend the entire evening, which we will not do, talking about these objects. But what I learned is that looking at the materials they are made of, we situate these two objects in a much more global context. In particular, the wood that you see is mahogany. Mahogany trees are native to the Caribbean, and they were felled by enslaved Africans to make room for sugar plantations. They then traveled back to Britain as ballast on ships, and once they arrived in Britain, they became a prized commodity, very inexpensive commodity for furniture makers who turned this exotic wood into a very fashionable new material. And instrument makers followed suit. And so you find in trade catalogs by makers of this time period an emphasis on mahogany cases, instruments made of mahogany. And mahogany is just one of the materials that our exhibition focuses on.
Yeah, and for me, my curatorial philosophy is quite similar to Paola's approach to the exhibition, and it's really predicated on the idea that through a very close study of objects, that we could really illuminate the stories that have not been told. And especially sort of the ones that are traditionally overlooked in the art history, our historical scholarship. And so kind of thinking about this exhibition, there's a kind of this sort of idea that an exhibition in art museum settings in particular, that when we talk about the topic of the intersection between art and science of Europe, it's really sort of presented as sort of like a local sort of benign phenomenon. And that was something that really sort of bothered me. As an art historian, I'm thinking about my sort of what is really important to me. And I've been kind of thinking about actually in this particular time period that we're dealing with in the exhibition is really about era of globalization and conquest on unprecedented scale. So how do we sort of talk about that and bringing that element into the exhibition and thinking about what does that look like at the intersection between art and science was really important. And for me, at the end of the day, what do our visitors really want to see? And how this exhibition can really talk about or help some of our visitors, especially those who feel like they really don't belong here or feel like they're not really being seen in art museum spaces. How can this exhibition help them feel that they're being seen? And also, how can we have a very difficult but necessary conversations around European colonialism? So for me, these are very difficult questions to answer, and there's absolutely no straightforward path to answer them. But those are the kinds of the guiding principles through which I really kind of looked at the objects and conceived the exhibition. But as Dave mentioned in our introductions, I had no prior background in early modern science. So that, as the science piece of the project, was a whole new territory for me. And so by working with Paola, I really, really learned so much.
And if I can add a few things that you just reminded me of, is that there was something that was very important for me in thinking about this exhibition, which was the presidents how scientific instruments dating from previous centuries are displayed usually in museums, whether art museums or other kinds of museums. And so what we normally see is an emphasis on the aesthetic qualities of the objects. They are presented as technical marvels, or if they're displayed in a more scientific context, they are usually presented as relics of science. And we really wanted to detach ourselves from this model and invent new ways of displaying these objects. So on the one hand, there was the research for the objects to display, based on the stories we wanted to tell. And so foregrounding colonialism, European colonialism, of course, was really our main goal. And many questions emerged as we started working with this goal in mind. And so in terms of which objects to select, how to display, questions of proximity, just exposition, sorry, it's a, and I just want to remind you of something that was really important as we were approaching the exhibition, and the main stories we wanted to tell was that we came up independently with the same exhibition title. We spent a lot of time thinking about a title. We wanted a two-word title. And it was amazing when we just said, what if? And it was the same.
Yeah, so that was one of the very special moments we've shared. You have a lot of those moments. We're happy to share with you a little bit more on those too. So Paola, let's talk about the process of putting together exhibition. Dave Skelly mentioned a little bit about sort of the genesis of the exhibition. And at least from sort of the archival sources, I was trying to dig through our internal server. I had thought that our exhibition was first conceived in 2015, but as I've just learned just moments ago, before this program started, that actually predates that by at least 1 or 2 years. So I'm just blown away by the long history of this project. And I also do want to note that this whole idea of putting together this exhibition at the intersection between art and science itself was kind of the original. It was a sort of an idea that came from my predecessor, Paola D'Agostino, who's now working at the Bargello Museums in Florence as director. So I really want to kind of constantly sort of go back to her and really honor her for her really starting this project to begin with. And due to a lot of the changes that happened over the years, this project was basically put aside for quite a few years until I arrived at the gallery in 2020. What's remarkable, still gives me kind of chills thinking about it, is right before I joined the gallery in April 2020, my supervisor, Larry Cantor, put me in touch with Paola Bertucci, who was working with who had worked on this exhibition very briefly, or at least had a conversation with my predecessor about this project many years back. And the date that we actually were first put in touch was actually February 24th, 2020. So exactly 3 years ago on this very day, that's when we were first connected. So I thought that was just absolutely amazing and heartwarming.
Yeah, and in my case, actually, there is, of course, a longer history, which is the great privilege of teaching with Yale collections. I make use of an enormous amount of materials from the collections here when I teach my seminars and lectures. And so I really familiarized myself over the years with the extraordinary objects, whether books, whether prints, whether scientific instruments, whether works of art that talk to the topics I teach about, which is, broadly speaking, the age of the scientific revolution. This is a label that we chose not to use in the exhibition. We didn't want to celebrate anything. We wanted to have people, visitors, think about the making of scientific knowledge in relationship to these commercial and colonial endeavor undertakings of European states and empires. And so on the one hand, there is this teaching activity. So I learned with the students about the masterpieces that are here, arresting works that have really interesting histories. I was thinking, visiting the exhibition, that there are two exhibitions in one here. One is for the eye. If you don't read our labels, you have a perception of the exhibition that is based on the aesthetic qualities, very strong visual presence of these objects. With the labels, we invite you to wear a pair of glasses and see these objects in a much different context. The other thing I want to mention is that as the curator of the History of Science and Technology Division, I've always been eager for this collection to be more broadly known. And that's one of the reasons I am so grateful to you. This feels, in many ways for me, a dream come true. I've said that before, I will say it again. There is so much to learn about science, art, and culture by looking at these objects. My division at the Peabody Museum has been very lucky to receive donations from Professor Thomas Lentz, who is emeritus of cellular biology, who is a collector, and put together a remarkable collection of scientific instruments dating to these early times and more. And so that was another reason that pushed me to, that influenced also this exhibition. And then, really, more importantly, as an historian, there is a disconnect that I perceive between what happens in my field, in my academic field, the history of science, technology, and medicine in early modern Europe, which is really very rich with studies that emphasize colonialism, the slave trade, the connections between commerce, global commerce, and scientific work. And then these modes of display in museums that insist on the aesthetic qualities of the objects or on their nature as relics of science. So this has been very important in my approach to the exhibition. And I really learned a lot through my interaction with Jessie and with other museum staff here at UAG, who made me look at these objects in yet another ways that I hope we will get to in a minute or so.
Great. So Paola, what were some of your most meaningful moments in the exhibition production? I know we have a lot to cover, but can you share with the audience just a snapshot of?
Well, we worked with an advisory committee. We have some members here that offered feedback on our approach. So we always had this idea for grounding colonialism. It's better said than done. And we realized that literally every day, we thought we were hitting our target, and then when we got feedback, we realized we were completely missing it. And so through these interactions with the advisory committee, staff at UAG and beyond, my thinking really, I really came to appreciate in much more granular way museum work and what putting together an exhibition means. I don't think people like me who work in academia and are more accustomed to writing essays can really appreciate the amount of work that goes into writing a 70-word label. It's probably comparable. The importance of individual words, we lost sleep over individual words. And so I think that was most definitely the most remarkable thing that happened, together with many more. I really want to acknowledge the work that goes on behind the scenes. Putting together an exhibition involves a lot of people. The two of us are here. You saw Stephanie and Dave, but there are tens, dozens of other people working whose expertise, skill, and really work ethic has as much influence and impact on an exhibition that what you see right now, represented by the four of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially when we have had these wonderful, extremely illuminating and productive conversations with our advisory committee, one of the things that we were able to do by inviting them into our space in this time of working on this exhibition together is to really kind of think about how to bring different voices into the project. That it's not going to be simply a point of view from one person or two people, but we want to bring as diverse communities, as diverse voices as possible. So that was, I think, one of the really beautiful and memorable aspects of this exhibition production. And I think, and as we were kind of talking about colonialism and its legacies and foundations, we were able to really do a lot of self-reflection in our really kind of very private conversations we've had. And I think that was another really a beautiful moment that we shared with one another. And I think because of also kind of thinking about COVID and how much that has really impacted this whole process, there were many, many challenges to really building an even exhibition checklist. There was moratoria in place because of COVID. There were staffing concerns, et cetera. And so it wasn't until actually last summer that the exhibition checklist was finalized. So it was a lot of those challenges, but at the same time, we had breakthroughs, and some staff members really went out of their ways, above and beyond, including Alexi Baker sitting in the back, to really give us access to these objects so that we could see them and look at them, examine them as closely as possible. So really, really thankful for so many people who have helped us along this process. And also, I wanted to show you this one more slide here, and on this point, that one of the things that I find really personally really interesting is that conveying meaning is not just with the beauty of the objects that we selected or just the ways in which we wrote the labels, but how do we display them was a whole huge piece. And in these cases, in the second section of the exhibition, we have portraits of instrument makers who are very prominent figures of their time. But we purposely did not hang their portraits high so that you would admire them. That sort of in your embodied experience going into exhibition space, if you're sort of average height visitor, you will see them really at the eye level. So that was one way of conveying the meaning, that you have to really confront this reality. Who are these people? And you could question them. You could admire them if you want to, but these are the kinds of kind of embodied experience you want to draw out from installation. And then the image on the right is basically a really interesting case that idea of basically a case that deals with basically machines, gigantic machines in which different peoples have engaged with. One is actually a European engagement with a machine. Another one has to do with enslaved Africans engaging with a machine. And so we didn't want both experiences with two different types of machines to be comparable to each other. They should not be compared. And so we wanted to actually kind of shift gears a little bit and actually turn the angle of one of the books to actually look quite unsettling if you just look at it from far. But that was meant to kind of think about, okay, these are kind of talking about similar things, but not quite the same. And so those are the kinds of the little visual but display cues that we embedded into the installation objects to really convey meaning in the exhibition. So speaking of objects, Paola, let's talk about some of the objects that we really want to highlight for our visitors. And as mentioned earlier, materials really play an important role in this show. So let's talk about these first two. I know you personally love these objects so much, so we could probably spend all night actually talking about these two. No. However, but just for the sake of time, why don't you just share with our audience a few words about these two objects that you love so much?
Maybe we should just preface this by saying that paper is a very important medium in the exhibition. If you visit, as we hope you will, after this conversation, you'll notice that paper is not just a material, it's a technology. And we have a number of paper instruments, books that were in fact used to calculate and find things or to visualize the interior of the human body. And paper is a very important material in instrument making too. We have a compass with paper, we printed paper, etc., etc. And so I love this set of playing cards from the Baniki and the Pocket Globe that comes from the History of Science and Technology collection, and seeing them together to illuminate how play, pastime, played such an important role in conveying and constructing these Eurocentric worldviews that are at the center of this exhibition. I'll just discuss very briefly the Pocket Globe. So this is a 3-inch terrestrial globe encased by a celestial chart map in two hemispheres. And imagine the sense of power that comes from holding such an object in your hand, carrying it in your pocket. And why would you do that as an 18th century most likely man? It's a conversation piece. It's one of those objects that make up the techniques of the self, they're called in the literature, in the sense that they define these gestures that you carry out routinely define who you are. The objects that you want define who you are. And so holding this globe, open it up in front of your friends, having a conversation about territorial dominance, because the Pocket Globe represents also the James Cook third voyage, or George Henson voyage around the world. You have the sky in your hand. So you really have the entire world in your hand. And visions of European dominance over the land and waters, but also over the entire universe. So it's a very powerful little object. I should probably skip the playing cards, which are delightful, and I hope you will notice them when you visit the exhibition. They represent mathematical instruments that, when we use the term mathematical instruments, it actually means much more. Mathematical instruments are also astronomical instruments. They can be optical instruments. They are globes. They are navigational instruments, for sure, drawing tools, and so on and so forth. And so you can see through this set of playing cards how it became important for European elites to familiarize themselves with these objects and play with them and learning about them through play. And these are objects that we present in the exhibition as tools of empire. These are objects that enable navigation, transatlantic navigation, that enable surveying and land dispossession. And so it's fascinating to think of play and taking out from the domain of innocent pastime and seeing it as a practice through which these dehumanizing practices get normalized, become transparent in the European elites world.
Yeah, and for me, just a really quick note on these two objects is the fact that kind of from our historical point of view, even though these objects are basically dating to the 18th century, I think about sort of the longer, earlier tradition that precedes the production of these objects, especially the playing cards on the left. They're the really tiny prints that have these didactic text at the bottom, and you have these beautiful images with all the intricate details at the top. And that kind of images, these type of prints actually come from these sort of prints that carry sort of a didactic purpose, carrying some moral meaning or religious iconography that I've seen in cases with at the very beginning of the 16th century in Northern Europe. So you have this kind of traditions that keep kind of enduring through time. That really is a kind of a foundations upon which these cards were produced. And also, if you think about the pocket globe, the ways in which the pocket globe is made is that you have these sort of a wooden hollow in the middle, and you have these segments of paper, which are called gores, and they were actually put together to construct a globe. So for me, it's kind of the idea of fragmentation of geography, and how if you put them all together, it becomes a whole. Is another way of kind of thinking about not just the production of these objects, but the fragmentation of knowledge and putting together, assembling together to make a whole is another way of thinking about how knowledge production is really done during this period. So another object we absolutely love is this very, very stunning Microsoft slides that was produced in the workshop of the Amsterdam-based Microsoft slides maker, Abraham Ipelar. And this object, even though those of you who haven't seen the exhibition just yet, and this photo might fool you, but it's actually smaller than the palm of my hand. It's really, really small. It's tiny, but there's so much to see in there. And it actually comes with an inventory. It bears a signature of the head of the workshop. And also kind of thinking about this object, we think about material history and its trade. Especially, Paola talked earlier about mahogany, and that's actually the mahogany, the type of so the mahogany was actually used to basically construct the case of this object, and also the slip case that actually comes with it, which is not photographed here. And the white sort of circles that you see in each specimen, those are made of ivory. And ivory is another major global trade material that has a lot of very complicated implications. And its acquisition with killing of animals, enslaved labor that was behind carrying the ivory tusks, the harvested tusks into the coastal regions of Africa as well as parts of Asia, and to bring back to Europe. And the specimens themselves that were encapsulated in these ivory containers, they're really gathered from around the world. They really range from silver ore to Menelaus butterfly wings, to white poppy seeds, jewel beetle, peacock feathers. You really name them. They're really coming from all over the world, really from Suriname, Brazil, the Moluccas, etc. So kind of thinking about that sort of trade and how that so much is embedded into European, not just commercial, but also colonial expansion is really encapsulated in this very small object. And also kind of thinking about the design itself. It looks like really a piece of these different pieces of jewelry. And there was actually sort of cross-pollination between the jewelry makers and instrument makers during this early modern period. So that's another really wonderful aspect of this exhibition, that we could really kind of think about this sort of a dialogue between makers across different types of trade.
And I'll just add something. So thinking about the two exhibitions in one, I think this really encapsulates that very powerfully, because you can look at it and is visually stunning objects. And at the same time, this speaks to these processes of colonialism and slave trade also that we want you to consider as you look at these objects. And so I'm thinking in particular of natural history collecting that was widespread scientific practice in Europe that happened also because these natural specimens traveled often aboard slave ships. They came from all over the world. When they came from certain parts of the world, often the carrier for these natural specimens were the slave ships. Slave ships also transported naturalists, voyaging naturalists. The trade companies, the Dutch, the British, the French, had these ports that served astronomers, voyaging astronomers on missions to map the stars or measure the various meridians on the globe. So this is one object that really materializes loads, if not all, the themes that we present in the exhibition.
Great. So the next the type of objects we want to kind of highlight is made of shagreen. And I know, Paola, you have a special fond of shagreen, so I'll leave some space for you to talk about it.
So this is a fascinating material. It's leather made from fish skin. And the fish can be usually shark or ray. Shagreen is the process that turned fish skin into leather. But when the fish is ray, as in this case here, there is a fascinating history. And it has to do with the Indo-Pacific particular ray that became shagreen here, as you see here. Shagreen was a material that was used in Japan to cover swords. It's a very resistant material. It provides very firm grip. But when it became this European commodity, it changed slightly its feature. It becomes very polished. It has a pearl-like appearance. It can be dyed in different colors. But the distinctiveness of this material is that it is extremely hard. It's very, very difficult to work. And so it's extraordinary that we have instruments that are covered in this material. As you see here, we have it is estimated that only 10% of scientific instruments made in the 18th century were covered in shagreen, given the difficulty of working with this material. And so the fact that we have two, and actually the collection has more, is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. And also shagreen, because it's so lustrous, is whole kind of another a bigger kind of aspect of the European absolute fascination, love for anything that's lustrous. So there's this whole phenomena of Europeans wanting to collect Chinese export ceramics, for example. They're highly glazed and very translucent. There's obviously importation of shells that were gathered from in the Pacific. There's also mother of pearls, and the application of that material into excellent Japanese export cabinets for the European market. So kind of thinking about the application of shagreen for these scientific instruments can be kind of seen through that lens. And also, one of the things that's really, for me, fascinating about these objects, these two examples in particular, is the fact that shagreen almost always is accompanied by the color green. And I kind of figured, I was kind of thinking, like, why green? And at least from sort of the research I've done to this point, is that there were actually sort of a precedent for this, that there were actually sort of these, the type of embossed leather, of the donkey leather that was impressed against seeds that were made in Persia, and those were actually dyed in green. And they were actually circulating in Europe before this period. So there could have been that sort of a visual type of material tradition, and that sort of shagreen could potentially sort of mimic that type of material. So that could be a reason to kind of think about this as well. And last but not least, this is obviously our poster child for this exhibition, and one of our absolute favorites in the exhibition. This is an object that I'm absolutely obsessed with, and I'm constantly doing research on this. But it's an object that is showcased in our section called Clockwork Cosmologies. And this is a section that's really about gear mechanisms, and the conceptions of the world and the universe is really kind of encapsulated in these type of objects. And for this one, we are looking at an object that actually can be operated. And some of you may have seen our highly viewed YouTube video that shows this object in motion. You could actually wind it in two different places, and it could actually move forward. And the eyes of the figure, who's actually the goddess of hunt, Diana, and her eyes oscillate left and right. She actually releases arrow at the very end. So it's really a fascinating work. And the fact that you could really look at this object, think about not just mechanisms per se in motion, but think about the kinds of representation we're dealing with here. Some of the kind of the details I could highlight here is the fact that the chariot is supposedly here, in theory, being pulled by 2 African panthers. And so, and kind of thinking about the origins of these type of animals and the ways in which they're depicted. They're depicted with goatee, and that type of visual sort of imagery comes from likely in a late 16th century book by a German naturalist, Konrad Gessner, whose really richly illustrated book on natural history does depict these type of animals, including the African panther with the goatee. So that's a kind of possibly a visual source in which the artisans who are making this object could have reference from. And speaking of artisans, it wasn't a work by a single person. So there's many different types of expertise that went behind the production of this object. So thinking about the gear mechanisms, those were done by clockmakers. The sort of the kind of dark, kind of black case that you're looking at the bottom of this chariot, that was actually made of ebony. And ebony is another major global trade material that were really sourced from parts of Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and then Madagascar and Southeast Asia, and later, in the later part of the 17th century, in the Caribbean. So kind of thinking about that sort of material history, its trade, and the enslaved labor that went behind the acquisition of materials. And there were actually dedicated cabinet makers of this type of, to make these type of objects as well. And so that was another expertise. There was enamelists, there was a person who was gilding them, you name it. So there was a lot of metal smithing person as well, metalsmith as well. And so we're kind of thinking about this whole collaboration of multiple hands that went behind the production of this work.
And I'll just add that this section, clockwork cosmology, is probably the most ambitious in the exhibition, and it addresses a theme that is very dear to me intellectually, that I find really captivating, which is time. It is very easy to underestimate time as a construction. We are so accustomed to live by the watch that we don't think of time as something that is made. It gets so naturalized, and yet there is so much to say about time. It was definitely an instrument of colonialism, imposing routines, calendars, rhythms on communities, groups who had a completely different relationship to the passing of time. That's one aspect. The other aspect that fascinates me is the automatism that this object encapsulates, and that is reflected in clocks, watches, machinery, but also in the machinery of the universe as it was represented in this time period through the orreries. They are solar systems that can be put in motion by means of a geared mechanism activated by a handle. This idea of everything working together underpins notions of hierarchies among humans and the role that each human plays on Earth. And this is what we are trying to capture in this very ambitious section, and we're eager to hear if we have been able to communicate the power that these objects in paper, gilt, brass, and wood or gold, metals represent.
Yeah, so speaking of time, looking back, Paola, how is this show really meaningful to you?
Oh, this is a wonderful question. First of all, I think there is one very deep issue, profound, that I feel profoundly, which is I see myself in the role of translator. in this curatorship. Not all that you see is my scholarly work, of course. I think that I am mediating between the amazing scholarship that many people in this room and many others beyond produce. And so for me, it was imperative to find a way of using objects to reach broader audiences for this very important work that historians of science, technology, medicine are doing. The other thing that I'm very eager to communicate, and I hope this exhibition is successful in doing this, is to move away from the narrative of isolated geniuses that make science. This exhibition foregrounds the collaborative nature of scientific work. Any practicing scientist knows that. But for reasons that escape me, this is not commonplace still today. We celebrate individual inventors. We celebrate Nobel Prize winners as if the everyday work of science was that. Whereas the individual work, the everyday work of science is collaboration, exchange, and instrument making also, inventing new ways of understanding the natural world. So I hope that as we point our finger to colonialism and these dehumanizing practices, land dispossession, we are also sending an empowering message by foregrounding the collective, collaborative work that took place behind the scenes in artisanal workshops, and also by foregrounding the role that indigenous communities, enslaved individuals were making to scientific developments. I think we are also sending an empowering message to people who feel marginalized in their own everyday.
Yeah, so speaking of collaboration, as we mentioned before, this was not a project that was done just between the hands of just the two of us. There was it literally took a whole village to be able to produce this, to work on this project and produce it and look the way it does. And I really want to really kind of really acknowledge the labor and the amount of support that we were able to receive that may not be fully represented here on this stage. And also I want to also personally thank Royce Young-Wolf, who's also in the audience with us this afternoon, for her just, her pouring her heart into really looking closely at some of the labels we've asked her to review for us. And I think her contribution to insight was absolutely critical to our interpretation. There's also Sumenchi in our education department. There were also some of the graduate curator interns that worked on this project with me, Manon Godet and Kartika Puri, who are all Yale graduate students here. They really also poured their heart into this project, as well as Ida Brooks, who's also who's an undergraduate student here at Yale. And also Lexi Baker, as I mentioned, she was working on this project as a collaborator. And there's obviously so many other staff members here at the museum who really worked together to help us really mount this exhibition. And for me personally, this show is really meaningful because I actually was going through a personal transformation while we're putting together this exhibition. And for me, I really learned how to tap into my subjugated self. As a person of color, like navigating the European art field, that's not easy. That has not been easy, and still is not easy to do. But for me to kind of tap into my subjugated self and think about how can I draw upon the pains that I carried into looking at the past and really try to tell these narratives that have been oftentimes overlooked in our scholarship was something that for me was really powerful and something that I had not done in the past that I'm able to do, that I was able to do with this project. And so I really hope that, I think for those of us who are in this room, who are really belonging to the underserved, underrepresented communities, I hope that you feel that you too have a voice, that you do have a purpose, and that you could really change this world. So on that note, we would like to turn the mic over to the audience. There's actually 2 mics on either side of this lecture hall for any questions.